Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Factual Faith. Today, I have an amazing conversation with Matthew Su, who is a studying philosopher at Cambridge University. He is about to earn his PhD soon in that field. I apologize for my nasaliness as I am currently getting over a cold at the moment. Regardless, it hopefully doesn't stop Matthew and I from having a productive conversation, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Matt, thank you for being here. I am really excited to have you on this episode today, where we get to sort of pick your brain about philosophy and especially philosophy in the Christian world. If it's all right with you, I might get you to sort of introduce yourself, tell me a bit about your journey, because I understand that you were once in law. Is that correct?
I was once upon a time.
Yeah. And then you're now PhD in philosophy. So tell me where that all came from and where you're kind of heading and yeah, that whole story.
Oh, well, yeah, it's not a tremendously interesting story. I I I grew up in New Zealand. I went to uni in Australia because at the time, I thought I'd have a career in the law, and Australian law was a bit more exciting than New Zealand law. Uh, yeah, I went there. But of course, my whole life I've been a Christian, and I've always been very interested in the defense of the faith, and a lot of those tools happen to be philosophical. So I took the opportunity when I was studying law to also study philosophy as a second degree. So I've always been sort of divided between those two subjects. Yeah, eventually I did get out and practice for a little bit, but I always saw it as sort of building virtues for when I do what I really want to do, right? Uh, and yeah, no, eventually the time came, and I decided to start making a real go of philosophy. So I went back to the University of Sydney and did a Masters of Philosophy there. And now I've come to the University of Cambridge, where I'm doing a PhD in philosophy of religion.
Okay, there
And
you go.
that's the short version.
Yeah, right. Because
Yes. So to clarify, I'm not a PhD yet. I'm in the
yeah,
process
you're
of
getting there. You're getting there. Right. I see. Yeah, because you first caught my eye when you appeared on the premiere Unbelievable episode recently. Well, it was aired recently. I don't know how long ago you actually filmed it.
yeah.
Um,
It was in October, I think, toward
okay,
the
there you
end.
go. Yeah, but that one aired fairly recently, and you were in a debate with an atheist fellow, and and you guys were kind of, I guess it was more of a question and answer kind of style
Yeah.
conversation rather than a full blown debate. But there was I was really impressed with your answers because they were very clearly well thought out. But also I also wanted to then get you further onto my podcast because I was like, this podcast is all about truth seeking as best as possible, and for any of the listeners, equipping people or allowing them to kind of drop in on a conversation, and letting them judge for themselves if they feel like the truth is being arrived at or closely arrived at. So
Sure.
yeah, I thought it'd be really cool to have you on to just chat about your understanding of philosophy and your understanding of philosophy in the Christian faith.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
so to begin with, I guess I wanted to pick your brain on your understanding of sort of philosophy in the Christian faith in the
Mm,
past and how you feel like it's kind of led and
right.
changed and formed the Christian faith over time.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess it helps first of all to clarify what exactly we're doing when we talk about doing philosophy, right? People have all sorts of different ideas. Some people it's more rigorous computer-like thing, and other people it's just like, whatever you come up with in a late night sesh with your bros, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so to sort of give like a brief definition to start with. So philosophy, the way I think of it, is thinking in its most general form. Whenever you start thinking specifically about something, you end up branching off a discipline that has specifically to do with that thing. So, for example, thinking specifically about living things, well, you've got biology. Thinking specifically about sort of physical things, you've got physics, right? But when you start to ask questions like, "What is a thing?" Then you're doing philosophy. Why? Because that's talking about things in the most general sense, right? Specifically, the question, what is a thing? That's a question in the philosophical subdiscipline called metaphysics, right? So metaphysics, nothing to do with crystals. It's talking about your basic categories of existence. But of course, existence is not the only like very general category that things can that we can think about. So, for example, people think about action in all kinds of limited domains, right? How should I act as a lawyer? How should I act as a construction worker? How should I act as a banker or whatever? And there's sort of customs and best practices to go with that. But if we think about it really general, we get to the questions of ethics, right? How ought I act as a human being in general, right? What in general should take priority over something else? That's ethics. Uh, Another feature of philosophical thought, and again, how do I paint? You go to an art class, but what is beauty? You ask a philosopher. Um, what was I? Yes. So another sort of area where you get into philosophical questions is when you start burrowing into the first principles of any discipline, right? So we talked earlier about biology, that's the study of life, but you can ask foundational questions that biology itself is not designed to answer, like what is life, right? Not actually that straightforward. There's a huge literature on philosophy of biology, and that's what ends up happening. You get philosophy of physics, philosophy of anything. Whenever you ask the foundational questions about any discipline, you brush up against philosophical questions. So yeah, so that's basically philosophy. That's why philosophers we often consider ourselves, the ancestors of all the other intellectual disciplines. Everything else is just a limited way of doing what we do, right?
Yeah.
We fancy ourselves the connective tissue that unites all these things. Now, because philosophy is just thinking, at in its most general form, everyone is in some sense a philosopher, right? So the question that you asked, like, what is it to do with the Christian faith? Like, should we bring it in? Well, you can't help but do so. You're
Yeah.
already doing it, in
Yeah.
fact. Whenever you interpret something, whenever you say, we say God is all powerful. Well, you mean something by that,
Yeah.
right? There's some kind of underlying philosophical conception going on. So really, we have no as creatures created with intellects, with the capacity to think, and because thinking, whether we want to or not, it infuses everything we do. We can't help but do philosophy. So we don't have a choice between doing philosophy or not doing philosophy. We have a choice between doing it well or doing it badly, right? Either either in such a way that will let us get toward the truth, or in such a way that will lead us away from it. And from very early on, Christians have recognized this, right? So if we look at the Gospels themselves, we see, the beginning of John, of course, very famously, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and of course, the Greek word for that is logos. Whence we get the word logic, right? And in invoking that concept, which is of course a concept that was already understood by the Greeks in that time, right? So for them, the logos is, as it were, the divine reason that orders all things to their ends and so forth, right? So John first says, well, God is the logos. He is the intelligence that orders all things to their end. Uh, and that primordial intelligence is with God, and that primordial intelligence is God, right? So in that sense, that at which the philosophers aim, right? All philosophers aim to comprehend the logos, to see the logos in things. That at which philosophers aim is in fact the God that John proposes that we worship, right? We see in Romans 1, right? Paul, writing the letter to the Romans, he talks about how God's eternal attributes and his power are clearly inferred from what has, from what has been made, right? Again, that it shows that there is the created world mediates to us, the divine nature, right? And again, that's a fundamentally philosophical way of looking at the world. Um, Look at how Paul talks with the Greek Stoics in the Areopagus, right? Again, he uses their philosophers in whom we live and move and have our being, the unknown God, all these kinds of things. He uses these concepts that the Greeks understood in order to propose God to them.
Yeah.
Um, yes, and of course it's not just restricted to the Gospels and the Epistles. We see from the early church, one of the earliest Christian writers we have, Justin Martyr, right, 2nd century AD, already, right, bam, like writing to the emperor saying, "Hey, we Christians are philosophers, guys, just better philosophers than you guys, because yeah, we great luminaries like Augustine, Athanasius, all very advanced philosophers. Basically, in old Alexandria, the pagan Platonists and the Greek and the Christians were just going to each other's lectures all the time, right? We've always been involved in this kind of thing, and it's continued up to the present day, right? Nowadays, I don't know if your readers have heard of guys like Alvin Plantinga or William Lane Craig or J.P. Moreland, Richard Swinburne, these kinds of fellows. Some of them teach at the very best of universities. I'm learning philosophy of religion here in Cambridge, right? The very best universities, Christians have been doing philosophy all the way up to the present day, and that's because Christianity just gives us really good reason to be concerned with philosophical topics. One of the big problems the pagans face actually was that although they're very smartest, of course, nerds are the same everywhere. We're always interested in this kind
Yeah.
of thing. Uh, it's not the same for everybody, right? The average person just lives his life steeped in superstition, and ignorance, and he's got no real reason to be otherwise, right? Whereas Christians, you get two of us together and we start discussing theology.
Yeah.
It's pretty. We have a very compelling reason to ask. Well, what is the good? What is the true? What's life all about? What is the meaning of all things, and what ought we do to attain it? Right. So yeah, so and that's how I got into philosophy, frankly. Like, Christianity primes you to ask these questions and to search for these answers. So uh and uh and it really does help us answer this, right? One example, for instance, is the doctrine, let's say the doctrine of creation, right? So we say God created the heavens and the earth, right? Well, what do we mean by that? How comprehensive is it, right? Someone might say, well, maybe God, at some point in the distant past, uh, conjured everything out of nothing, and ever since he's just sort of watched it go by and occasionally intervening to cause things. Right? That's one conception. But there's another conception where, everything is so inherently void of existence that without God continually actively sustaining it, it couldn't exist even for a moment. Right? So yes, God created in the past, but he's also constantly creating now. Right? Uh, and to think of the world as sort of radically contingent in this way, and to understand why it is best seen as contingent, right? Uh, Contingent is just a word that means sort of where something doesn't have to exist but depends upon something else for its existence. That's contingency. So yeah, so where something, to think of something as contingent, to see is precisely to see the world as you know uh, in its very nature, sort of revealing that it depends upon something more fundamental than itself, right? So, so in this way, you know, that really helps us understand what the Bible says when it says mysterious things like "In Him we live and move and have our being." Right? That's a pagan sentence that Paul endorses. He says, "Yes, this is true of God." Right? Well, what does he mean by that? Well, that he means that not only was God involved right at the beginning, he's even now creating everything. Everything we do and are sort of constantly comes from him.
Yeah.
Right? So to figure these things out, to give us the tools to think about these things, that's basically what philosophers do.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, that's really cool.
yeah.
I really appreciate that. Especially because, the I really like the point that you made that as Christians we are philosophers whether we like it or not, right? We exist in this place where Christianity isn't a thoughtless relationship with Christ. We're not simply drones or pawns, or we're not simply just following a set of rules that our God has set in place for us to just act out periodically, right? It's a thoughtful relationship. The Bible describes it as a wrestling. Even there's constant statements throughout, like you said, especially throughout the Gospels, where you get these huge claims coming out of the Bible, and you're like, wow, where are these claims coming from? Let's unpack some of these claims. Let's unpack some of these ideas. And it kind of forces you to wrestle with truth and wrestle with reality if you want to follow Jesus. If you want to be a believer of the Bible, if you want to be a believer of God, you actually have to wrestle with these ideas, and you have to think through these concepts, especially if we want to communicate them as well, right? If we want to be able to communicate them, we have to have thought through what we believe and what we live out. And I think that kind of neatly transitions onto the next question that I wanted to ask you, which is just to talk about a little bit about what you see the role of philosophy looking like today. You mentioned sort of what the role was, or I asked rather, what the role was in the past and how that's kind of shaped and defined Christianity. But today, it's sort of, I guess probably as an umbrella idea, it's probably all still the same, right? Like you said, we're still just thinking about truth, and we're still processing truth and the claims of Scripture. But maybe sort of at its extremities, it starts to look a little different, especially in today. What do you sort of notice about today's philosophy and the philosophical goals of today versus maybe in the past?
I think one thing I'd like to reiterate is what you've just mentioned, that in a way it hasn't changed, right? Philosophy is always doing what it's always done. That's kind of its nature,
Yeah.
right? We're always asking the same questions, always noodling over the same answers, just with further and further elaboration.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's true. But I think what's changed in modern times is that, so it used to be the case that the average Christian could outsource his thinking to a professional.
Yeah.
Right? So to your pastor or to an academic somewhere. You don't really have to think because you're surrounded by Christians who largely agree with you anyway, right? It just doesn't come up. So, although I think every individual Christian actually should strive to be as good a philosopher as he can be, people are busy,
Yeah.
So it was possible hitherto, I think, to live a life largely insulated from these questions. But nowadays, everyone, as it were, is expected to be on the front line and to be an expert and so forth. And Google gives us the illusion of omniscience, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, we are ever more conscious of the fact that, not just intellectually, but practically conscious of the fact that people disagree with us, right? They have reasons for their disagreement. And if we want even to maintain ourselves, let alone witness to others, right, we've got to have reasons. Why? And the reason is the fact that I alluded to earlier. We're philosophers anyway, right? So if we are surrounded by bad ideas and we don't have good ideas to counteract them, or we don't have the equipment, we don't have the intellectual equipment to counteract them, we will find that our philosophical side starts drifting away from our faith side, right? From our theological side. And although for some people in this struggle, theology wins out over the philosophical side, in other people, the philosophical side, when it's led astray by bad ideas, wins out over the theological side, right? And then you get deconstructions, deconversions, or whatever. I think a large part of this, like the sort of circa 2000-ish sort of success of atheism, is people suddenly realizing that, well, their philosophical side has drifted so far from the religious side. The religious side has become so compartmentalized
Yeah.
that it's become very easy to just discard it. So yeah, as a matter of self-preservation and also of witness, I think philosophy is even more important nowadays. And in fact, it's even more in God's grace, we live in a time where the riches of our Christian philosophical inheritance are at our fingertips, right? You don't actually need to attend the universities with the Dominican monks to
Yeah,
learn the
yeah,
basics.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
you can have these conversations over the internet, for
yeah,
free.
yeah.
uh, yeah, so in that sense, not only do we have the need, we have more opportunity than ever to get to get good at this side of the
Yeah,
Christian life.
I
Yeah,
actually really like how you phrased that, because there is this, in the same way that in the past, if you had issues with, your car, it was only a mechanic who could really work on some of those really tricky issues. But now, if you've got a decent set of tools, and YouTube, there's probably someone who's pulled apart your very car all the way down to its individual pieces and rebuild it back up together again. Um,
yeah,
and
mm,
while, of
yeah,
course, mechanics still exist and we still use mechanics, and someone doesn't have the time to learn to disassemble an entire car, there is so much benefit in being able to, you know, service your own car for yourself, right? You probably save a lot of
yeah,
money. You're able to, do it in your own timing, what have you.
yeah,
And so much more so if the faith that you live and engage in is a faith where, like you said, you don't have to outsource your knowledge, and you don't have to, if you've got a good friend of yours who is coming to you with questions about your faith, you don't have to say, "Oh, well, hold on, dear brother. Let me go back to my pastor, or why don't we have dinner with my pastor one day, and you can ask him all the questions or something." And it's like, well, no, we kind of lose touch with the idea of living the faith, right? We got to live it so much that it's a part of us, and we
yeah,
kind of can show that living by not only showing the actionable aspect of the faith, but showing the logical aspect of the faith and the philosophical aspect of the faith too. Um,
yeah,
yeah, and it definitely feels like there's a real plus minus with the internet age, that we now have it all at our fingertips, like you said, but it also almost is like a
mm,
double-edged sword
yes,
where people feel like they've gotten all the information that they need to get from a single Google search,
mm, yes,
and
yes.
it takes a little bit of that responsibility away when you can kind of just take your favorite
Mm. There's a
philosopher
yeah,
or your favorite news station or whatever,
mm,
and they can just beam information into you, and then you can beam that
yeah,
information to the next person, and it's done, right?
yeah. That is a downside of the internet, and I recall a very funny Mitchell and Webb skit where this priest mocks some pleasant visitors to his church, and he goes, "Oh, spiritual, not religious, are we? You think you figured things out after a 15-minute internet search?" Something like that. Yes. So as much as the internet age does give us the opportunity you know to be philosophers in our own right. I do want to, as a Christian, sort of sound a note of caution.
Mm,
Right. The great temptation of the internet age, of course, is to think that because you've done your own research, that therefore you are entitled to pass judgment on
yeah,
2,000 years of intellectual history,
yeah, yeah,
and that is very rarely true unless
yeah,
you are a real genius.
yeah,
So, it's
yeah.
it's a great resource to draw on, but the Christian has more than just himself, right? So,
Mm,
as much as it behoves, so it's like learning self-defense, right? It's good for everyone, strong, weak, young, or old, to know something about self-defense, to know what to do in a dangerous situation. Uh, but that shouldn't, you know, cause you to think of yourself as a soldier, right? Like
yeah, yeah, of course, yeah,
that's not the point.
yeah,
And for a Christian, of course, our faith is not founded in our own philosophical acumen, right? Or in our ability to Google search the answers to things. Our
Yeah.
faith is
Yeah.
founded in Jesus, in the church, in the scriptures. So one of my favorite philosophers, actually, he's kind of my spirit animal. Um, he has this great motto. I think that and every Christian, I think, should bear in mind when going into these sorts of matters, and that is, his motto is faith seeking understanding.
Mm.
Right? I do not understand so that I may believe, but I believe so that I may understand.
Yeah.
Right? This was Saint Anselm of Canterbury, the guy who wrote the very famous ontological argument, if you've heard of it.
Yep.
And what this means is that the Christian faith, by its very nature, directs us and primes us to believe certain basic things. Right? God exists. The universe and everything in it exists for a reason. Right? There is in fact an objective good. We ought to do the good. We ought to avoid evil. We ought to seek justice, and avoid injustice. Love is the supreme virtue, right? Uh, Human beings do not end at their deaths. God especially concerned with us. All these, so Christianity primes you with a whole bunch of philosophical attitudes that, yeah, I think they can be justified. Don't mistake me. I think a lot of what we think as just coming from the faith, reason itself can sort of give independent support to it. But where you begin as a Christian must be with the faith, right? Because there's the temptation as a philosopher is to pick and choose. Yes, this makes sense. No, this doesn't, right? But the illusion of competence that gives you is that you think what should be kept and what should be tossed away, but
Yeah.
actually very very few people do.
Mm.
And those who do are very humble about it.
Yeah.
They pick and choose only with great trepidation. So, Christianity comes to us as this package. It's deeper than any one single person can fathom. So, in our spiritual lives, we imbibe that package. We get practice putting it into action. We allow it to condition our thoughts, and then, as philosophers, we go, well, I have these thoughts. Now, how do I understand them?
Yeah.
Right. So the faith, the truths to which faith commits you as a Christian, these are not up for negotiation.
Yeah.
But what you can do is you can say, well, okay, sure, those are true, but what light can reason shed on what I first believed by faith,
Mm.
right? And you will find actually that this is a great advantage as a philosopher, right? You are biased toward, so it sounds a bit self-serving, but you're biased towards the truth and you're biased against untruth. So you're
Yep.
less attracted by dead ends and wastes of time, right? And if you do it well, and not everyone does it well, but if you do it well, you will find, and I say this from my experience at least, that not only do you understand your own view better, you also understand other people's views better.
Yeah.
Right. The great philosophers in the Christian tradition. So I'm thinking of guys like Thomas Aquinas, the great Roman Catholic philosopher. He synthesized the thought of Plato and Aristotle with Christianity. That was his sort of big accomplishment. He came up with this, great mutually reinforcing system that incorporates theology and philosophy into one unit. And that makes him conversant with everyone. So he can say, well, oh yeah, sure. So, I agree with the Hindu up to this point, and because the Hindu makes this move and Christ makes this move, this is why we disagree, and this is why I can, and that gives me an inkling as to how to respond to, say, the Hindu's claims, or again to the atheist claims, right? So there's nothing new under the sun. All these things have been thought before. And to be a Christian actually is to have kind of a foot in the door in the conversation with everybody.
Yeah.
Right? That's sort of where you're aiming at as a Christian.
Yeah.
And in my experience, you don't get there if you're not a Christian. So, for example, a modern atheist might think, well, I as a modern atheist understand everything about everything, right? But they have a lot of trouble understanding what people in the past thought because they've got no fundamental sympathy, right? You find in history of philosophy, you get a lot of Christians actually, because only Christians really bother about really understanding what people of the past thought, because only they can sympathize. Um, my professor at the University of Sydney is one such person.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, good.
it really does happen that way.
Mm.
Um,
So for um for the Christian who
mm,
is kind of coming to that revelation where they're looking at their faith and they're saying, I I do have these thoughts. I do have
mm,
these pressing desires to seek truth. I do have these pressing desires to calculate truth and calculate and to attempt to
mm,
quantify, to attempt to fill in that picture that is what is truth and how do I think about it. Um,
mm,
what do you recommend are sort of the building blocks and the stepping stones of
mm,
helping a Christian to wrestle with
mm,
philosophy and to grow in philosophy and to best get them started on that journey of truth seeking?
mm.
Because there's Christians all over the place that think they're doing truth seeking now. And for some of them, it might look like the Earth is flat and chemtrails,
Mm.
and there
Yeah,
might
yeah,
be another group of
yeah, yeah.
Christians who think they're also doing truth seeking, and their idea of truth seeking might be totally different again. And we've got this camp and this camp and that camp, and so for a lot of Christians, it might be extremely disorienting.
Mm.
So how do you kind of speak to a Christian and just kind of pop some tools in their tool belt of saying, hey, give this a
Yeah,
go, search in this direction, start here, and this will be what helps you to approach truth
yeah,
as best as possible.
yeah. I think. Oh, yeah, that's a big question because there's lots of different Christians with lots of different starting points. There's no one size fits all solution. But I think generally what you want to do is firstly one nowadays underrated aspect of philosophical learning is what we call dialectics. So that's basically engaging in discussions with
Yeah,
other similarly interested people. I think, in my experience, that's the best way for these concepts to really sink into your bones, right? Don't treat it as like studying for a test.
yeah,
Think about it as, going over a conversation many times so that you know all the twists and turns of how it's going to go.
yeah.
And if you're really interested in things, like you already in your experience have these kinds of you already have experience what it is like to know a kind of conversation to this sort of level, right? So basically, first order of business, find someone uh you know that you can have intelligent discussions with. I recommend a pastor. Most pastors are, I think it's still the case that they're reasonably well educated,
Fingers
better
crossed.
than
Yeah, we would
yeah,
hope
yeah,
so.
yeah.
Yeah,
Uh, yes, yes. Most reputable denominations will have will have someone qualified that you can at least begin to think about these questions with.
yep, yep.
Um, Now, as a philosophical educator, so I've taught philosophy at the university level, and in putting on my academic hat, I would say, well, actually, you ought to give a real go of it and study the actual philosophers themselves. So
Mm,
read your Plato, right?
yep.
Read your Republic. I recognize that not everyone's going to have the time for that, right?
Mm.
Failing that, read a good modern introduction to the discipline. There are and there's many levels at which this is put. So C.S. Lewis is often a famous gateway drug to this kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
yeah. He sure is.
read mere read Mere
Yeah.
Christianity, read Miracles if you're feeling
Yeah,
feisty.
I'm a big
Um,
fan of Problem of Pain. I think that's probably my favorite work of his. I think that one really kind of, if you want
mm,
to kind of stress those thinking muscles, if it's, the first couple times you've ever been to the gym and you want to really kind of load the weights up a little
yeah,
bit, you
yeah,
can jump straight into that book and give that a go. But he still does it in a really
yes,
approachable way, which is nice.
yes. So yeah, so I looked at the question list you gave me, and when it came to this question, uh, I came up with a whole bunch of books in a bunch of different categories depending on what you wanted to do.
Yeah, right.
So I'm what's called a Thomist. So I really like the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. I
Mm,
think that I don't agree with Aquinas on everything, I mean, he's a Catholic for one thing, but I do, I do think that he generally has, he's a great point of departure. Like if you want to know what a very intelligent Christian, from the past, uh, would think about the question, Thomas Aquinas is usually a good, you know, generic smarty pants to
Yeah.
start your inquiry with.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, there are, like, his way of speaking and his terminology may not be familiar to us as moderns. So I tend to recommend, like, popularizing introductions that just sort of are able to let us get into that kind of headspace.
Yeah.
Right. So to that, I recommend the books Aquinas: A Beginner's Guide by the philosopher Edward Feser, Feser.
Hmm.
I'm sure I'll send you a list later and you can post it or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Sounds good.
If you're feeling a bit more advanced, you might read Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, a guide and commentary by Brian Davies. Right. So these will get you into canonical thinkers like that. If you like the same Edward Feser, of course, has another book which I'm hesitant to recommend to atheists, but I would recommend it to Christians because it's so polemical in our favor, right? This was written at the height of the new atheism. Everyone was feeling very spicy, so it's like a very spicy introduction to the history of philosophy.
Mm.
And the name of the book is The Last Superstition.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. These books I'm rattling off. There's no shortage of popular introductions to the philosophy of religion nowadays, and you can very easily find one and just get started. Generally thinking about these sorts of questions. Um, Podcasts, history. So just for philosophy in general, I recommend History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just a great way to get to grips with the whole sweep of philosophy. Because one of the great things that you ultimately acquire with a philosophical education is this appreciation that there is indeed this great dialogue going on between between all the wise, right? And you end up seeing what Christianity's contribution to that global sort of wisdom is, and you come to a better appreciation both of what is distinctive of us and what we can contribute to others. So that's why I would recommend getting it, a general idea of the Great Sweep. So podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, very good. I'd also recommend Copleston's History of Philosophy, just if you want it in sort of book form. It's not super up to date with the most hyper modern stuff, but it's good for getting a sense of a historical sweep. As I said earlier, canonical philosophers that you really ought to get familiar with. Plato, very readable. Everything he writes is a dialogue, right? There's personalities and fun illustrations, and yes, I can't recommend Plato enough. Read the Republic. Do read him with a grain of salt as a Christian. He doesn't know everything. He's a heathen, but you'd be surprised how much he gets right. Right?
Yeah.
This is what the best of the non-Christians can think, and you might find that an idea or two that we think of as belonging to us actually, this guy also thought of it, also agrees with us, also has good arguments for them.
Mm.
For example, in Book 1 of the Republic, Plato defeats nihilism.
Yeah.
He's
Right.
struggling with it now,
Yeah.
but Plato dispenses with it right at the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition. Read Descartes. So Descartes I recommend, not because I agree with him. In fact, I disagree with him on most things. But if you want to know where a lot of modern ideas got their origin, Descartes' your man, right? So where did this idea, for instance, of the universe as consisting primarily in sort of mathematically describable objects come from? Well, it comes from Descartes. Where does this idea of man being a mind and a body that sort of just are accidentally related to each other? Again, I mean, that's not quite what Descartes thinks, to be fair, but you can see how that sort of idea morphed out of what Descartes came up with.
Mm.
So Descartes, very important. I've already mentioned Aquinas, but another person, I've also mentioned him, but I want to emphasize Anselm.
Yeah.
Anselm of Canterbury is a great medieval Christian philosopher to be, for beginners especially, because he was writing in a time where he couldn't presume that everyone around him had, even the educated people had very good. He couldn't presume that they had very good educations. Right? So he's writing during what we would definitely think of as, the Dark Ages kind of has fallen out of favor as a term, but there was indeed a time where sort of literacy and academic connections were at a
An
low point.
almost
Right? And
educational dark age, I guess.
yes, yes, and Anselm was writing in the like towards the end of this Dark Age.
Yeah.
So, but that means that his philosophy is not super technical, right? It's phrased so that in principle, an intelligent layperson, his brother monks could understand it.
Yeah.
So it's a great way for us to get into, again, how smart Christians of the past used to approach things,
Mm-hmm.
and in a way that's not too deep. Yeah. Yeah, so those are my preliminary
Yeah.
recommendations.
I
So,
really
so much.
appreciate that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I do really appreciate, and there's a few names in there that I personally have kind of delved into a little bit. I was somewhat familiar with Anselm beforehand, because for a long time I was attempting to kind of wrap my head around ontological argument and really trying to familiarize myself with that. And once that clicked in, there was like this realm of philosophy that I realized I hadn't explored that kind of really expanded my brain and my ability to defend the faith. And you introduced me to Thomism just a couple of weeks ago, which I've been doing my best to study up on my Aquinas lately, and that's been really awesome. So I really appreciate those recommendations, especially because like you said, if you're able to understand that there is kind of a wavelength that all of these thinkers are all already kind of operating on, if you're able to kind of tune into that wavelength and tune into the conversation, you realize that there's this whole area of thought left to explore and or that's currently even being explored. And we almost kind of, I think we almost need to kind of understand that unless we attempt to drop in on that wavelength, the discussions and the thoughts that we're having currently are we need to understand they're already being had and they're already being assessed, and it's much wiser for us to look at where for lack of a better term, where the meta is, where where the progress is currently. If we're if we're in this realm where we're building buildings out of complicated alloys and double reinforced glass and this, that, and the other, deciding to start again by building mud huts is, it's useless kind of progress. It's like, why would we start from there when you're better off learning about the building technology of the cities today rather than, to start again and attempt to figure it all out for yourself, make use of the resources that we have in this time, so you can as quick as possible get to where you're able to be useful in the field of ministry, whatever it may be.
I think one if I can just chuck another illustration out there, the history of philosophy is a bit like, it's a bit like a country where people keep building cities atop cities atop cities, right? The country has bones, and if you know where the bones are, you know roughly the shape of the kinds of cities you can build on those bones. And people just keep retreading the same territory, often making the same mistakes, often rediscovering the same truths. So if you can understand the back and forth, you get a sense not only for where people are coming from, but where they're headed. Right. One really striking example to me when I first began learning philosophy was I was reading The Republic by Plato. Right. Let me just look up when it was written. So Plato's Republic, written 380 BC, right? There's the part where he talks about what he calls democratic man, so people with what he calls a democratic soul. And reading it, he's criticizing them, of course, but reading it, Plato is criticizing me. he's looking directly out of the pages of the book and going, I see you there, democratic man. I see you, your inconstancy, your calling good evil and evil good, your love of the kind of liberty that doesn't lead to virtue, but,
Yeah.
puts vice on level with virtue, which gives you a life where you try one day to be a philosopher, a lawyer the next, something like that. He's talking directly to me.
Yeah.
And yeah, you realize that, there is in fact, to know this stuff really is to master uh the bones of something real. So well, the two benefits, right? One, you're not surprised, right? A lot of the reason why Christians often find themselves disoriented is that a great shock comes upon them all at once. The problem of evil. Oh no,
Yeah.
it's such a great problem. I can't see immediately a solution. You know, Sometimes that's so destabilizing that it leads to a deconversion. So if you're not surprised, you can take it in your stride. If yeah, sure, one person, but there's always answers. The sense that these things have been thought before and they will be thought again. That's very very comforting and stabilizing in your journey to understand these things.
Yeah, I
Like,
actually really want to talk about that. I've discussed it a few times on this podcast, the deconstructing era that we're in at the moment, where people are deconstructing their faith. And I have this really love-hate relationship with the whole deconstruction era, because I think there's a really healthy deconstruction that can occur. I have deconstructed my faith a few times now, but all in the goal to reconstruct a healthier, better version of my previous faith, right? And one of the greatest things that have helped me to deconstruct and then reconstruct something even better was my philosophical understanding of the faith and any of my philosophical endeavors. That was what helped me rebuild my faith in a way where the structure that was rebuilt was much sturdier, much better, much more glorifying in every sense of the word. I mentioned earlier C.S. Lewis's problem of pain, right, which is addressing the what I would personally call the most difficult argument for a Christian to answer, which is, the problem of suffering, the problem of pain. How can a good God exist in a painful world, and any sort of variation of that question, right? And of course, I wrestle with it, and like you said, of course, so has everybody else that's come before us, right? And so it is really reassuring to be able to look at this problem and actually have resources in this day and age where if you put a little bit of time and effort into reading and studying, listening, what have you, you can actually form a much greater resolution than maybe what you previously had. And it starts to give hope rather than to feel hopeless when you're met with these questions. The hopelessness of the problem of suffering really does feel overwhelming the first time you attempt to grapple with something like that. But the more you kind of study your philosophy and you wrestle with those ideas and you think and you attempt to resolve these things, the greater that hope is that builds in you, the more that you kind of fill that answer out. And for me, it's become a point where I cannot justify anything other than the Christian faith. Not because the Christian faith not because I have all of the answers in the Christian faith, though I do believe God does have all the answers. And hopefully that we will make sense of them one day. It's more so that I can't see any other belief system answering anywhere near as well as the Christian faith does, right? It's not so much a matter of I am just hedging my bets and hoping that the Christian faith is correct, and I'm just gambling with this, because that's what leads to the deconstruction, right? As people jump into this faith and they're like, oh, I just think this is going to be right, and then they go through the deconstruction process and they realize it isn't what they thought it was. But you end up reconstructing something that's really healthy and actually has far more answers than any other belief system had in the first place.
Yeah, I think so. One of the great benefits of that approach I mentioned earlier, faith seeking understanding, right, is that it gives you that space to deconstruct and reconstruct. If you start with faith, start with, a commitment to God grounded in a flourishing spiritual life, right? If you know and love God personally, if you meet Him, where two or more gather together, right, within your church and your community, it's very, that's a resource that will sustain you in the process of finding your feet, philosophically, right? The fact that we start with faith means that, we've got a stable platform on which to take or leave ideas, right? Because our faith doesn't ultimately rest on these ideas. We can say, well, that's a good argument, that's a bad argument, right? You you don't have to agree with everything that's said for Christianity. You also don't have to say that everything against Christianity is bad. Oftentimes, there's some germ of truth, and it leads in the end to a stronger result.
Yep.
But you should feel free as a Christian who's interested in philosophy to take or leave arguments as you find them.
Yep.
And that and that's a Christianity is freeing without being anarchic, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
that's exactly what you want it to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So this is how I like to sort of end every episode with this question. But I also feel like this is going to be the biggest question for you and I,
Mm.
because I always try and cater, especially for those listeners who maybe they're not Christian, maybe they're not even religious, maybe they're just entirely atheistic at this point.
Mm.
I guess I want to really touch on, for those who are not Christian,
Mm.
what is it about? Do you? Well, yeah. This is going to be a tricky question, and we're going to flesh this out, I guess. But what is it about
Mm.
philosophy that you think sort of necessarily couples it with the Christian
Ah.
faith? And what is it about, yeah, the Christian faith that necessarily couples, like, requires philosophy, and how do you think? What's your sort of challenge or your delivery to those who maybe aren't Christian to say, hey, like, consider this because this is actually, what we believe is truth.
Right. Okay. Wow. Big question. You're not letting me off easy.
No.
So yes. So right. So what can philosophy say to sort of illuminate what it is that makes Christianity so attractive? Well, I think that things haven't fundamentally changed, I think, from Plato's day. Because to be a philosopher, right, is to think hard about things. As I said, philosophy is just basically thinking. But what is thinking? Right?
Yeah.
Well, thinking is to perceive, both in oneself and in the world, the underlying principles that make things intelligible. Right. Well, what is it to have these underlying principles? Well, when we encounter the world, we encounter things that are diverse in many ways, right? But we find that beneath the diversity, there's always explanations that explain why these many things are arranged just so, or why these unrelated principles are related, right? This is fundamentally, and that sort of underlying commonality, that act of categorizing and discerning the underlying principles beneath the categorization and so forth. That is precisely what thought itself aims at,
Mm.
right? Now, because that's the case, if we think about where this whole project of thinking about things is headed, uh, the very nature of thinking imposes a kind of structure as to what the completed project will look like, right? So if we think, if we think of the project of explanation as uniting the many in terms of the one, well, what is complete explanation going to look like? What does it look like? To, what is it that it turns out that we are seeking, right? When we try even to think about things, well, it turns out that what we're seeking when we think about things is the one that explains the all, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The so thought is inherently, we are, a child can, of course, always ask the question, why ad infinitum?
Mm.
Uh, but that's just because the child is approaching the task in a very inefficient way, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we can think, well, what even is it to ask the why question, and what shape does that impose on the project of asking why questions?
Yeah.
And then we see that to the asking the why question, to seek out explanations that underpin diverse phenomena, is ultimately to seek the singular thing that underlies everything, right?
Yeah.
That's the only that's the only way in which the quest could be complete, and that's where the quest was headed all along. So what this tells us is that the very act of thinking methodologically seeks the one who is the creator and explanation of everything,
Yeah.
right? And this is not just original to me, of course, because Plato, right at the beginning of Western philosophy, has a very similar idea, right? All things have their origin in the one, which for him he calls it the form of the good, right? That explains what they are and how they ought to be. Uh, so that's one thing that philosophy can tell us. Philosophy shows us that the world and mankind is intelligible. That's just our starting commitment as philosophers. But we find that when we pursue that to its utmost, when we see what the overall shape of that inquiry is, we find something very close to what Christianity says.
Yeah.
Christianity does say, contrary to the polytheists, right? Contrary to the dualists, or contrary to polytheists, people believe in many gods, the dualists that believe there's a good and an evil God, or the monists who believe that there's only God. Right?
Yeah.
Christianity says, no, there is the many and there is the one that is the source of the many.
Yeah.
Right? There's only these few solutions really to the question.
Yeah.
And, philosophy helps us, Christianity endorses and philosophy helps us to see why one solution is better than the rest, right?
Mm.
Because what you get if you get a world that is fundamentally united and the diverse things exist in relation to the one, is you get a world that is down to its very basis intelligible. Maybe it's not intelligible to us, but in itself it is intelligible, right? It fundamentally makes sense. This is the kind of thing that it's not only an abstract thing, it's also very useful, right? If you think the world makes sense, you'll seek out the sense that it makes, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's where modern science comes from. It's no accident it was invented by Christians.
Yeah.
So that's what philosophy can tell us. But of course, there's limits to what philosophy can tell us, right? So it can tell us that the world is fundamentally intelligible, and therefore makes it very plausible that the fundamental principle of all things is an intelligence,
Yeah.
right? Uh, the thing that makes sense of all things can't make less sense than us, right?
Yeah.
It can't,
Yeah.
like a rock doesn't make sense of things. A mind makes more sense of things. So if there's a single thing that makes sense of all things, it'd have to be much more like a mind than not like a mind, right?
Mm.
So I think philosophy. To this day, in denominations like the Roman Catholic Church, it's an article of faith that, funnily, it's an article of faith that you don't need faith to know that God exists.
Yeah.
Which is very funny. Yeah, but there are limits, right? So it can't tell. So you can tell us that God exists. It can tell us that God is where all of our inquiry is heading. In fact, it's where all of our desire for good and life and justice and all these things ultimately comes from, and in relation to whom they have their meaning. But it can't tell us exactly what God is or who God is, right?
Yeah.
So philosophy both gives us an answer and it raises a deeper problem. And that deeper problem turns out to be, as far as philosophy can tell us, insoluble, actually, right? Because we want to know God who is, the ultimate explanation of all things. That's the only thing that will satisfy us. But of course, being finite human beings with only a finite, as far as we know, finite amount of time to study these things, a finite amount of time to inculcate, we could never catch up to who God is,
Yeah.
right? So in that sense, the God that philosophy reveals is so distant from us
Yeah.
that on the one hand, yay, we found him. On the other hand, oh no, we don't know him at all,
How do we start?
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We're sort of stuck. We learn at our best, right? At our very best, on our own power. We learn just enough to make us realize how infinitely far short of God, how infinitely far short of what we really want, uh, we fall, right? Uh, and that really, I think, for me, is where sort of Christianity comes in,
Yeah.
because Christianity says, well, you're not actually alone. It's not up to you to figure all. It's not up to humanity as a whole to figure all of this out, right? Humanity as a whole, even pooling all of our powers, we couldn't even begin to bridge the gap between man and God. What can happen, right? What we can reasonably hope for is that God will make a movement towards us.
Yes.
Right? Because we know that we were made for him. That's what reason can reveal. How that promise is going to be fulfilled, well, that's what reason can't tell us, but we can still hope that it will be, right? Because God has made us in such a way that our very existence contains this promise of himself. Um, and further, I would say that we can think about what the solution would have to look like, right? Because it could look like like Muslims say that the solution to this distance between man and God is that God sends a book, right? Sends a word through his prophet. Okay, sure. God has indeed given us a book. It's not the Quran, but but I don't think even if God sent a book, it would really bridge that gap, right? A book, words, there's inherent limits to the kinds of information they can convey, right? The medium is inherently limited. In fact, anything other than God himself who comes to us is only going to give us, in a very limited sense, that which we actually seek.
Yeah.
Right. In order for God to actually bridge that gap, he has to come to us in person.
Yeah.
And what is it to come to us in person? Well, again, if coming to us in person just means like appearing in a vision every so often, right? Or talking to us, through mere words every so often. Again, that's only ever going to convey a finite amount of what he is.
Yeah.
Right. What actually needs to happen, and this is what Christianity says happens, is that God became one of us, right? So one of, we human beings are inherently the kinds of things that, we're bound to each other on a level deeper than mere words can convey, right? So if God really wants to give us that which we seek, i.e. himself, then, he can't just send a messenger or a message. He has to come here in person. But how can that be? Well, the only, coherent way that could be, that finally bridges that gap, is for God and man to be made identical, to be made one, right? It has to be one man who is also God, right? And in fact, that is exactly what sort of Christianity sort of recommends. And only in relation to this, are all the other goods. It's because God has become man, that that the hope for immortality is vindicated, right? People often complain, what would I even do with immortality? Well, what you do with immortality, the kind of task that befits an immortal, right, is to share life with he who is immortal.
Yeah.
Right. So only because Christ has come does immortality make sense for human beings.
Yeah.
Immortality is a consequence of this great thing that we have, that is, we have received God himself in the flesh. Right. So, and, the reason why I'm so, and this is sort of what philosophy can tell us, right? It can not only tell us that we've got a problem, it can also say, well, what ought the solution be, right? Any other kind of solution to this problem is going to fall, either it's going to fall short of it, right? It's going to give us some substitute for God in the flesh, or it's just going to deny that there's anything other than God.
Yeah.
Like the Hindus do. And in the process annihilate us, which I think is very, it's not rational to go that far. Right. So in that sense, like, even purely philosophically, right, we think about philosophically what we ought to hope for as human beings. Like, philosophy can tell us, well, actually, you ought to hope that Christianity is true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And lo and behold, like 2000, we have witnesses from 2000 years ago that testify to this very thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing, of course, is that they weren't philosophers. They didn't know the significance of that which they were reporting, right? But if we think about it, well, actually, this actually is the shape of what it is to be human, right? And this confidence that this is indeed the shape of what it is to be human. I think that's what sort of philosophy can teach us.
Yeah, brilliant. I really appreciate that. That's an awesome answer. I think I could sense a little bit of John Lennox coming out in some of your explanations there, because he loves that that explanation of, science and even philosophy can tell you as much as possible. He uses the cake analogy. Have you heard the cake analogy, where he talks about he makes up a name and he says, oh, I have my Aunt May or something like that, and she makes this cake, and science can tell you about the composition of the cake and how everything that, down to the atomic structure, everything that could make this cake. And And science can tell you the exact temperature that the cake was baked at and all of that. But science can never tell you why she baked the cake or what the cake is for,
Mm.
right? And that I think is a brilliant way to kind of foray someone into really exploring not only philosophy but Christian philosophy, and like you said,
Mm.
that goal of arriving at God and that goal of arriving at why, that goal of arriving at
Mm.
what is the crux of all of this, what's the origin of all of these questions, what's the origin of the ability to ask these questions, and I think it necessarily points itself to God and the God of Christianity, um,
Mm.
to be able to answer those questions. Otherwise, you just simply can't. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a brilliant explanation. I'm a huge fan of how you worded that just then. The To get into maybe something a little bit more clinical, um, what sort of I guess recommendations and what do you think are sort of the Achilles heel arguments against things like atheism or simply just arriving at deism and leaving it there, or agnosticism, or what are these key arguments and points that people can
Yeah.
explore to say actually it is God and it's also the God of Christianity.
Right. Okay. So I think that if you want to boil down the basic thought of atheism, it's that ordinary things are enough,
Mm,
right? At some level, you don't need anything more fundamental than the kinds of ordinary things that we see in order to explain what we see. So the crux of I think every philosophical argument is to show that basically ordinary things aren't enough. So
yeah,
one way of one very simple way of thinking about it is think about, for example, um, composite things, right? Things that are made up of bits. Well, nothing that is composite exists in its own right, because of
yeah,
course there are more fundamental things on which it depends, right? But if everything was composite, right, then nothing would exist in its own right.
yeah,
So, there can't just be composite things. There must be something fundamentally non-composite on which, uh, other things depend. And then we realize, wait, no, there's a non-composite thing. Then, um, well, there can't be many of that non-composite thing because, say, if we have more than one of this non-composite thing, we uh, the 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 individual units have to have something in common, which is distinct from what is particular to each one, right? But if they have that internal division between what is common and what is distinct, they'd be composite,
yeah,
right? So if they're non-composite, then they can't be multiplied, and so there can only be one non-composite thing. But if there's only one non-composite thing on which everything depends, well, then you're off to the races, right?
yeah,
It must have all power, for instance, because everything that there is or could be must depend upon the same one thing, and so on and so forth. Um, so once you shatter that illusion that the many are enough, right? That ultimately everything tends towards the one. And I gave you a different way towards that by thinking about the structure of explanation,
yeah,
right? You see how all these what these arguments have in common is that they're ways of breaking through the apparent sufficiency of ordinary things towards some one thing that is not like anything else, which is the origin of everything else. Right. Yeah. So that's what you fundamentally sort of want to do.
mm,
Uh, Another thing that I think you can to take a completely different tack. Another thing that you want to do is you also want to restore the sense in which, like, the things that seem to matter actually do matter. So
yeah,
what do I mean by this? Well, atheists, they want they think that they're being very hard-nosed and rational by denying, things that everyone takes to be important, and saying, no, 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 it's all an illusion of consciousness, it's all an illusion of evolution and an accident of society,
yeah,
right? So these things aren't real, they don't really matter, and that's the rational way to look at it. So one area in which philosophy can enlighten us is to show, actually, that is, that's what we call an overly reductive way of looking at
Yeah.
things. You leave out a lot of what is actually significant, a lot of what's actually observably real, in order to arrive at that reduced picture of the world, right? So take, for example, ethics, right? So one thing that I might differ from other Christians you may talk to is that I actually think that you can get to the basics of ethics without, even meta ethics, right? You can get to the basics of what's good for human beings without having to invoke God directly.
Sure.
So we can think about, the kinds of the objectives that human beings are sort of functionally directed to seek, right? Just as a heart, what makes a heart is that it has the function of pumping blood. So the heart is for pumping blood. Human beings, being organisms, are for living, right? And being rational entities are for thinking. So thinking and living, these are sort of inherent, are the goods, the ends that we seek, the goods that are inherent to what it is to be human, and therefore anything that systematically destroys or undermines these aspects is bad, right?
Yeah.
So we can arrive at the good and the bad, right? Yeah, and this is not strictly incompatible with evolution, but it is incompatible with like a reductive view of the world that says that the only real things and the only things that matter are these, inanimate nothings, or that sort of, in order for human beings to matter, we have to invent our own values
Yeah.
heroically,
Yeah.
like Nietzsche would say. No, neither of these things are correct. Human beings exist, therefore there is human nature, therefore there are the ends of human nature, therefore, there's an inherent intelligibility to the things that we are made to seek, right?
Yeah.
And of course, to say that we are made to seek is to sort of give away the answer a bit here. But, nevertheless, like the fact that we are oriented towards things is something that sort of towards determinate ends that control the other ends that it makes sense for us to seek. All these kinds of things are things that philosophy can reveal. So, you people who say that life is meaningless, not only are they, unpleasant, they're also demonstrably wrong. Like,
Yeah.
life cannot be meaningless because human beings are inherently creatures with ends that they seek.
Yeah.
Therefore, there must be a meaning to things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so these kinds of things are ways in which philosophy can, as it were, from the ground up, build toward what Christianity declares from the top down,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
ideally, as a Christian, you want them to meet in the middle,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really great. I like what you said about the spotting the kind of secret reductive points in a lot of the arguments, because I do find that that's one of my major frustrations whenever I'm sort of assessing maybe an atheistic perspective on things. One of the classic arguments is the arguments for the origins of existence, to which atheists usually boil down to the Big Bang. And then if they're ever questioned on, what gave rise to the Big Bang, what came before the Big Bang, a lot of the arguments that I see being put forward today as a response is, well, that's like asking what's north of the North Pole. And that's sort of the argument that I hear the atheists respond with. And I do feel like that's a classic reductive point. Like that's a classic just, you've boiled it down into like a very basic assumption of, well, going north of the North Pole is exactly what asking what is before the Big Bang, is. And then in that, you're making a statement that going north of the North Pole is nothing, and so therefore going before the Big Bang is also nothing. And it's just this like affirmative dismissal of, don't bother, we already know there's nothing there, let's ignore it, let's just live in the natural world and ignore like any further investigation.
Right.
And I find,
I do kind of have to speak up for the atheist here a little bit.
mm,
So I wouldn't say they're being reductive. What they might be saying is something like, um, you know, I'm making a proposal, right? That time is like north.
yeah,
And if time is like north, then there doesn't necessarily need to be something that's more north of north,
yeah,
right? Uh, if you want to show that, there was something north of north, then you owe me a reason for why my model is wrong,
Sure.
right? When my model has all these other explanatory virtues. So this is basically what Stephen Hawking argued in A Brief History of Time, which is why I remember it very well. But of course, but I think you're also right. So on the one hand, I think you're wrong in that the atheist proposal is a bit more serious than
Sure.
you were putting forward. Yeah, reductive. But I think you are right in that causality goes deeper. Yeah. So yeah. So causality goes deeper than time, basically. Right. So what is causality? Causality is where something gets its existence in some sense from something else.
Yeah.
Right. So it applies to time, of course. Like the present moment got its existence from things that happened in the past in some sense. Right. But that's not the only sense in which things are caused to be. So as we talked about earlier, composite things, right? Composite things get their existence from the underlying components, right? Existence fundamentally consists not in priority of time, but in priority of existence, right? So then you can say, well, all right, so even if time is finite in the sense that you say, Mr. Atheist, nevertheless, there's a more fundamental sense in which even the first moment of time needs to depend upon something more fundamental, because without that first moment of time wouldn't even exist, even in the moment in which we said it exists.
Yeah.
Right. So that's how you deepen the concept of causality to say, right, even if you're right, you've actually neglected to have this much richer idea, because I think you do intuit this, right? They think they've got it wrapped up in a bow when really they've only tied things up along one axis.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a better way of
And they've
putting it. Yeah.
neglected to explain the whole. Yes. So yes. So
Yeah.
qualification, but also I think you fundamentally got something there.
Okay, there you go. And I realized I actually skipped one of our questions, so I might come back to this question and then we'll end it here. So I guess with philosophy, obviously, it helps us to make sense of things as best as we can, make sense of our faith, make sense of the claims of Scripture, make as much sense as we possibly can. For the Christian, the goal is to be like Christ, if we were to extrapolate the original Greek. And so, to finish things off, do you believe that philosophy can actually even just be used as a way to deepen your relationship with Christ, deepen your understanding of Scripture, and actually just become more Christ-like, which is our goal in the first place?
Oh, yes, of course. So, I mean, for one thing, philosophy helps us to appreciate just what it is that God has done for us, right? When you understand the distance between us and God philosophically, only then do you begin to comprehend what a wonderful thing was done when God came in the flesh. He's not like, a Hindu God who puts on a meat suit.
Yeah.
He permanently became one of us to be with us. Uh, it philosophy helps us to see, Christianity proposes that Christ is the meaning of things. Philosophy can help us to understand what it means for Christ to be the meaning of things, right? How is it that all of human life builds up to him? Why should we say that human life builds up to anything? Why should we say that it builds up to Christ? As sort of, if you follow the train of thought I laid out earlier, well, that would explain, and that's one way in which philosophy can help us to see. Another way is that philosophy can help us to understand, if Christ is the Logos, then everything that he does has a reason behind it.
Yeah.
And philosophy can help us to understand his reasons in the best possible light. So, for instance, Christ, when he came, issued certain, I wouldn't call them corrections to the law itself, but corrections to the ways that people saw the law, right? Rather than a system of, imperatives and obediences. Actually, these imperatives and obediences have a further purpose, which is to help human beings be good human beings, right? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right?
Yeah.
Made for man. It implies that human nature itself is the constraining thing that gives the law itself its shape, right? Or again, what God has put together, let no man put asunder. Do not do not divorce. This is not how it was in the beginning.
Yep.
Let it be one man, one woman. All these kinds of things. This is Jesus appealing to the created nature of things in order to set the law in right order, right? Another word for this that Christians have used historically is the natural law.
Yeah.
Right? When we understand the natural law, we begin to see. Now, of course, we shouldn't use this as a means to judge God, right? If God doesn't fit with my understanding of natural law, therefore he's wrong. No, but nevertheless, if we do it right, we do it humbly as a Christian, we find that actually the natural law sheds a lot of light on the things that God does for us. Even like it helps to appreciate even the things that don't come under natural law. So in sort of Christian theology, there's what's called the three theological virtues, right?
Yeah.
Faith, hope, and love.
Yeah.
What makes them theological virtues is that they are not natural virtues, right? They're not virtues that we can attain by ourselves. But of course, that raises the philosophical question. Wait, how is it that, surely I can have faith, I can love, I can hope, without God? Why would they be theological virtues? Well, because these are the kinds of virtues that have a supernatural terminus, right? Why? So say to love someone, right? Philosophically, to love someone is not just to have warm feelings, it's to will what is good for them. And philosophically, the good is whatever it is that perfects your existence. But in order to perfect your existence, I have to understand you in relation to the cause of your existence, in
Yeah, and to
relation to God.
understand what perfection would look like, right?
Yes, exactly. And you can't do that just in the natural order, because to do that, you'd have to understand God, which we know philosophically you can't do.
Yep.
So what's needed to have real love, real supernaturally complete love, is the only hope that we have of such love is if God comes in the flesh. So, that sheds light on why love is this. Yeah, why love is this eternal thing that outlasts and transcends and is the basis of our continuing to enjoy God, even despite the fact that our bodies pass away, right? It's because love, is the very nature of God. And again, actually, one really that just comes to mind, speaking of love, God is love, right? Everyone knows this. What does it actually mean?
Yeah, what does it mean? Yeah.
It's got a fuzzy feeling floating in the void. Actually, philosophy shows us that it's a very serious metaphysical proposition, because to say that God is love is to say that, first of all, what's love? Love is the will toward the good, and the good turns out to be being, right? Whatever it is that perfects you as the kind of being that you are. So, God, if God loves us, God also wills our being. And that ties together love and creation, by the way. But if in loving us, he also reveals his inner nature, then God, God, the thing by which God creates us is more fundamentally grounded in who he is to himself, right? God is intrinsically the will toward being, as it were, and that ultimately gives rise to the structure of the Trinity. For of course, the Father knows the Son reflects the Father, and they love each other, and the Holy Spirit bears that love. That's a historical Christian way of thinking about it. So thinking philosophically about love turns out to reveal to us all these deep connections between creation and this fuzzy feeling that we have inside, right? This fuzzy feeling that we have inside is not just a fuzzy feeling, it turns out to be, in a very, very distant way, of course, an approximation of, the fundamental nature of reality. And how awesome is that? And these are the ways, these are we're just scratching the surface here of how philosophy can enrich your understanding of the Christian doctrines.
Oh,
I hope
man.
I wasn't too...
No, that was awesome. That's a terrific answer.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I hoped for. Great. Well, that's a really awesome way of summing everything up, as I would hope for. I don't even really need to sum anything up now that you've put that terrific little explanation together. Look, thanks so much, Matt, for coming on the show. This is a really enlightening episode. And my hope and my prayer is that everybody listening to this will be able to hop in on those recommendations that you've given and hop in on that wavelength of philosophy and attempt to grow in their understanding and their ability to communicate their understanding through this. So I really appreciate all of that, Matt. Thanks so much for donating your time and having a chat with me today.
Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna copy paste the brief book list that I had composed before I forget. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, I will pop that in the description. And and if you want to check out Matt's recommendations, it'll be in the description of this video. Awesome.
All
Thanks
right.
so much, mate. I really appreciate it.